Dojo goes silent. A third-degree black belt is pointing at the cleaning woman with the mop, his voice carrying across 30 faces. Come on, fight me. Or are you too scared and deaf? She sets the mop against the wall. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't sign. She doesn't do any of the things a woman in her position is supposed to do when a man in his position opens his mouth in front of an audience. She just looks at him. And in the front row, a 10-year-old boy who hasn't heard a single word tonight watches her face and understands everything. She steps onto the mat, barefoot, in faded jeans, in a plain gray shirt she was going to wash tomorrow. Somewhere in her apartment 3 miles away, a small wooden box sits closed on her nightstand. It has been closed for 3 years. Inside, a gold medal she has not touched, a ribbon she has not looked at, and a secret she has kept from every single person in this room. Except one. He is standing in the office doorway, and he is not smiling. The city made no sound. Not to her. Nora stood at the window of her third-floor apartment, coffee going cold in her hand, watching Portland wake up on a Tuesday morning. A bus hissed to a stop below. A man in a yellow jacket argued with someone on his phone, gesturing at the sky like the weather had personally offended him. 2 pigeons fought over a crust of bread on the sidewalk, one winning decisively, the other standing very still afterward, in the particular posture of someone pretending they hadn't wanted the bread anyway. All of it completely perfectly, absolutely silent, not broken, not a malfunction, not a thing that needed fixing, just the world going about its business. On the other side of glass she could see through but not hear through. She used to fight that word, silent, like it was a verdict she could appeal if she found the right argument. 3 years later she'd stopped appealing. You couldn't cross-examine your own nervous system. You couldn't file a motion against your brainstem. What happened happened. What was gone was gone. She pressed 2 fingers against the window glass. Cold, the winning pigeon flew away with its prize. The other one stood there a moment longer. Just stood there. On the sidewalk in the morning, and then flew away too. She turned from the window, put the coffee down without finishing it, picked up her bag, and went to work. Iron Ridge Martial Arts sat on the corner of Burnside and 23rd, wedged between a dry cleaner and a shop that sold custom bicycle frames. The sign above the door was red and slightly sun-faded. The hours on the glass said the place opened at 4 in the afternoon on weekdays. Honora arrived at 3:45, always. She had a key to the back door. Arthur Briggs, the owner, had handed it to her on the first day 8 months ago, along with a handshake that lasted exactly 2 seconds. And a tour that lasted exactly 4 minutes. Supply closet here, mop bucket there, vacuum lives in this corner, trash goes to the alley. Any questions? She'd shaken her head. Good, he'd said. And that had been that. 43 weeks, give or take. She came before the evening classes started, cleaned while the students trickled in, stayed invisible while they trained, finished after they left. The routine had a weight to it. She found dependable. And dependable, at this particular point in her life, was not a small thing. Nobody asked her full name beyond the first day. Nobody wondered about her. She was the woman with the mop. Background. Part of the room's furniture. Present the way a wall was present. Necessary to the structure. Unremarkable to the people inside it. That was the plan. She'd built it carefully and maintained it for 8 months. It was a very good plan. Right up until the day it stopped being one. The dojo smelled of rubber mats and effort, and the specific industrial cleaner she used on the equipment. She knew this building the way you know a place you inhabit quietly. Not through its official version, the version it presented to students and parents, but through the version that only became visible after hours, when the people left and the room exhaled. She knew which floorboard near the far wall had a soft spot. She knew the mirror on the east side had a slight distortion at the lower left corner that made kicks look longer than they were. She knew Arthur's office light flickered twice before it steadied, had been doing it for months. Probably needed a new ballast, probably wouldn't get one until the fixture actually failed. She ran the vacuum along the edges of the training area and watched the late afternoon light move across the mat. And underneath the cleaning, underneath the routine, underneath the careful architecture of invisibility she'd constructed around herself, she watched. The thing about watching people move, really watching, with the full attention of someone for whom watching had become the primary way of knowing anything, was that you learned things they hadn't meant to tell you. Nora had been learning this for 8 months. She had built a complete picture of everyone in this building, without exchanging more than 20 words with any of them. Derek Holloway, the head instructor, always tightened his left hand into a fist when he was preparing to say something he wasn't proud of. The teenage girl in the second row had perfect form but held her power back, had been holding it back for months, like she was afraid of what it might become if she let it out. Arthur Briggs watched his students from the doorway of his office, with an expression that read as neutral, but was actually something closer to worried and working not to show it. She knew these people. They did not know her. That was the arrangement. Derek Holloway was 28, third-degree black belt, earned through genuine work. She could see that clearly. Real skill. Real knowledge in his hands when he understood ancestors. Real understanding in the way he read a student's movement before offering a correction. When he was focused, he was a good teacher. Patient in the specific way of someone who'd spent years learning that patience wasn't absence of urgency, but a different application of it. When he wasn't focused, he was something else entirely. She'd watched him dismiss the overweight kid who struggled with cardio, not cruelly, just with a flicker of impatience across his face that the kid probably didn't catch. She'd watched him work with the shy girl who flinched at contact and find patience from somewhere, genuinely slow down, genuinely help. So the patience existed. It was just inconsistent, showed up for certain students on certain days and made itself scarce for others. She'd spent 8 months wondering what determined which. This evening, the advanced class was winding down when she felt the vibration change through the floor, saw the shift in light from the front windows, the door opening. She looked up, a woman, mid-30s, dark hair. The posture of someone who'd decided tiredness wasn't something she could afford. And beside her, moving with the specific contained energy of a child who'd learned to be his own early warning system, a boy, 10 years old. Bright eyes already scanning the room, building a map before committing to entering it fully. Leo Rivera. 3 weeks into his enrollment, she knew him. Not personally, observationally. She'd watched him in class twice. He learned by watching other students the way she watched the room, with full attention, building a picture before attempting anything, patient in a way that 10-year-olds almost never managed. He'd gotten his footwork cleaner in 3 weeks than some students managed in 3 months. He'd invented a drill himself, a short combination she'd watched him refine incrementally over each session, making tiny adjustments, the kind of meticulous self-correction that usually required a coach. He was doing it without one. She watched Leo spot Derek across the room and light up. Actually light up. The way a child does when they're somewhere they want to be and have no reason yet not to show it. Arek's face did something. Not hostility. Something more careful and more cold than that. A tightening at the corners of his eyes. The door closing so slowly you'd almost miss it if you weren't watching for doors. Nora was always watching for doors. She turned off the vacuum. She didn't mean to watch the conversation. She was near enough. And lip reading was not a choice anymore. It was how the world delivered its information. Arek drew Carmen toward the side of the room, away from Leo. The boy was already at the mat's edge, apparently oblivious, crouching into the footwork drill he'd been building for 3 weeks. Derek's mouth clear enough to read. I've been thinking about whether Iron Ridge is really the right fit for Leo. Carmen's shoulders went up a 1/4 inch. Derek, the instruction here relies on verbal commands, safety calls, real-time corrections. Leo can't respond to those the way other students do. Carmen. He's been keeping up. He watches the other students. He follows visual, Derek. That's not sustainable long-term. This isn't a situation where visual cues cover everything. Martial arts requires instant response to instruction. A student who can't hear a stop command in a fast-moving situation is a liability concern. Liability concern. He actually said that. Nora knew this because she watched him say it, watched the words take shape, watched Carmen's spine go 1 degree stiffer, and then another. And she stood there with the vacuum handle in her hand and understood, not from the words alone, but from everything underneath the words. The way people's bodies tell a different story than their mouths. That this wasn't the whole truth. She'd watched Derek work with struggling students before. She'd watched him find accommodation, find patience, find ways around obstacles that seemed architectural. So the capacity was there, which meant this was something else. What she didn't know yet, what she had no way of knowing, standing on the other side of the room with a vacuum, was the email. Derek had received it 3 hours earlier, from the insurance company that covered Iron Ridge. The language was administrative and therefore merciless in its clarity. Any student with documented disability status who sustained injury during training would trigger an automatic policy reassessment. The reassessment would result in a premium increase. The number attached to that increase was specific, large, and effective immediately upon incident. He'd read it twice, looked at his student roster, looked at Leo Rivera's enrollment form, with the hearing loss noted in the medical section. He wasn't cruel. He didn't hate the boy. He was scared of the number, of the liability, of another Jason Merritt, of being the person responsible again for a child getting hurt in a room he was supposed to make safe. But he didn't say any of that to Carmen. He said liability concern, which was true but was not the truth, and the difference between those two things was where most of the damage got done. Ara set down the vacuum. She moved across the floor. She didn't plan it. Or she planned it in the half-second before she did it, which barely counted as planning. She was moving before the decision fully formed, the way the body sometimes knows before the mind catches up. Derek turned, saw her coming. His expression shifted immediately to the specific irritation of someone whose conversation has been interrupted by a person with no standing to interrupt it. "Can I help you with something?" She stopped 3 feet from him. She looked at him, then at Carmen, then at Leo on the mat, who had looked up from his drill and was watching the adults with the cautious attention of a child who'd learned that adult conversations about him often went in directions he wasn't invited to influence. She looked back at Derek and shook her head, once, slow, unmistakable. The room around them went still in that specific way rooms go still when something unscripted starts happening, and everyone present knows it, but nobody knows yet what it is. Derek checked his audience. He had one. Parents who'd stayed late, students collecting their gear, a handful of people who'd stopped mid-motion. "Excuse me," his voice rising for the room now. "Are you trying to tell me how to run my school?" She didn't respond verbally. There was nothing she could say in the way he was expecting. But she didn't move either. She stayed exactly where she was, with the stillness of someone who had chosen this position deliberately and saw no reason to leave it, which somehow made him angrier than argument would have. He looked around at the watching faces, checked that this was landing the way he needed it to land. "The cleaning staff is here to weigh in on my teaching methods. That's what's happening right now." One uncomfortable half-law from somewhere near the wall. One person. Nobody joined it. "You know sign language?" His voice climbed when she signed something small to Leo, and the boy's worried expression broke open into a grin. You understand everything that gets said in this room?" She nodded. He ran one hand through his hair, turned to address the room rather than her directly. "This is what's happening. The cleaning woman has decided she knows better than a third-degree black belt, with 15 years of teaching experience." He looked back at her, and underneath the performance there was something real, something that wasn't just wounded pride but genuine destabilization, the particular alarm of someone whose category system has stopped working. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but this is my school, and I am not going to stand in it and be questioned by." He gestured at the mop she'd left leaning against the wall. She raised one hand, pointed at herself, then at the mat. The room held its breath for real this time. Derek blinked, processed. He stopped, started again. "Are you challenging me?" She nodded. A long pause in which several things happened on his face in quick succession. "You're challenging me to a fight." He said it to the room. He needed the room. "The cleaning lady is challenging the instructor to fight." He waited for the laugh that didn't come. Parents were leaning forward. Students had stopped moving entirely. The energy had shifted to something he wasn't controlling, and could feel not controlling, which was making everything worse. "Does anyone want to tell me if this is actually?" "Maybe let it go, Derek." The woman in the green jacket, parent of one of the younger students. She said it without heat, without drama, the way you say something obvious that everyone is thinking. He turned on her like she'd thrown something. "Let it go. She's standing in my dojo undermining." Nora stepped onto the mat. The action was enough to be almost rude in its simplicity. 1 step. 2. She was standing in the center of the training space in her work clothes, faded jeans, plain gray shirt, no shoes. And the stillness she stood with was not the stillness of someone who'd wandered somewhere they didn't belong. Derek stared at her. Then the decision moved across his face and settled. Fine, the word coming out controlled. You want to do this, we do it right. He stepped onto the mat, full contact, no adjustments, no accommodations. When I win, he looked directly at her. You take your cleaning supplies and find somewhere else to be. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Leo. The boy had moved to the edge of the mat, was watching her with the expression of a child who reads situations the way she did, through faces and bodies and the direction of attention, through everything that exists before and beneath language. He was trying to figure out what was happening and whether to be afraid. She made sure her face said, "I've got this." I looked at her for one more second, then gave her the smallest, most formal nod she'd ever received from a 10-year-old. She turned back to Derek, extended her hand. He shook it, too hard, the grip of a man making a point. She held his hand steadily, not competing with the pressure, and when they separated, he flexed his fingers unconsciously. An old reflex, checking what had just touched him. Tomorrow night, he announced, 7 p.m., full class. She stepped off the mat, picked up her mop, went back to cleaning the floor. Theo Banks did not leave with the other students. He was 24, brown belt. 3 years at Iron Ridge, which was long enough to have learned the difference between what a room looked like and what a room was. He stood near the equipment rack while the space emptied around him, watching Nora work the mop across the far end of the floor, specifically watching her feet, the weight distribution when she turned, the way her hips led the direction change rather than her shoulders, the small automatic adjustment she made when she shifted from the mat surface to the wood edge. Not a cleaning adjustment, not something that came from mopping floors, something older, more specific. The particular economy of movement that developed in people who trained their bodies to be efficient, for reasons that had nothing to do with housework. He took out his phone, typed a name, not certain of the spelling, tried 2 variations, read the result, read it again, looked up at Nora across the room, who was wringing out the mop with her back to him, the muscles in her forearms moving with a definition that suddenly made complete sense. He put his phone in his pocket. He did not say anything to Derek, who was in his office with the door most of the way closed. Did not say anything to Arthur Briggs, who had come out of his own office at some point during the confrontation and stood in the doorway, long enough to see most of it before going back in. Did not say anything to any of the parents making their way out, or to Carmen Rivera, who left last with Leo asleep on his feet beside her, her hand on his shoulder steering him toward the door. Because Theo Banks had spent 3 years learning things in this room, and one of the things he'd learned was the difference between information and interference. He knew what he'd found on his phone. He knew what it meant for what was going to happen tomorrow night, and he understood that handing it to Derek now would short-circuit something that needed to happen on its own terms. Some lessons only worked if you walked into them without preparation. He picked up his bag, nodded once at Nora, who didn't see it because she was facing the other direction, and left. Outside, the city was doing what cities did in the early evening, shifting registers, the daytime version giving way to something slightly looser, the specific Portland combination of streetlights and coffee shop glow and the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Nora finished the floor at 7:43. She put the mop away, checked the supply closet, turned off the lights in the sequence she'd learned the first week. Back door. The alley with its dry cleaning steam and the dumpster that smelled of the Thai restaurant 2 doors down. She stood in the alley for a moment. 3 years of careful invisible routine. 8 months of this specific version of it. And now tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, 30 people would watch her step onto a mat. She'd known, somewhere underneath the decision, that this moment was coming. Not this specific version of it, but some version. The return. Because you couldn't spend 8 months in proximity to the thing you loved most without it eventually reaching back. She walked home. Not the long way tonight. The direct route, 20 minutes, because she had things to do and the thinking she needed to do was better done at the table than on the sidewalk. Her apartment received her the same way it always did. Quietly, without demands. She went to the bedroom, knelt beside the bed, pulled out the gym bag she'd packed 8 months ago when she moved in, the one whose zipper caught slightly from disuse. She worked the zipper free. Inside, hand wraps, worn soft from years of use before they stopped being used. A mouthguard in its case. A training journal with a cloth cover, its pages dense with handwriting. And underneath everything, wrapped in a piece of gray flannel, a small wooden box she'd placed in this bag specifically, so she wouldn't have to look at it on the nightstand every morning. She lifted it out, set it on the bed beside her. Sycamore. She knew this because Sasha had told her once, running her fingers along the grain with the specific excitement of someone who'd just learned a new word. This is sycamore, she'd said. They use it for surgical instruments and salad bowls. Nora had said that was one of the stranger facts she'd ever heard. Sasha had said, I know, that's why I like it. She opened the box. The written faded from its original vivid blue to something closer to winter sky. Still blue, but quieter. The metal itself was unchanged. Gold didn't tarnish, didn't soften, didn't age in any visible way. Deaflympics 2017. Samson, Turkey. Women's Judo 57 kilogram gold. She lifted it out and held it in her open palm. It wasn't heavy objectively, but it had never felt light. There was always this, the sense of the full weight of what it had cost, which wasn't a complaint, which wasn't even grief exactly. Just the acknowledgement that some things you earn with more than training hours, and it takes time to understand what that means. She sat on the edge of her bed in her work clothes and held a gold medal and thought about a 10-year-old boy who had invented a footwork drill for himself and spent 3 weeks making it better with no instruction and no feedback because the movement itself was worth continuing. She thought about Carmen Rivera's spine going rigid 1 degree at a time. She thought about Derek's face when he'd said liability concern, how precise the words were, how chosen. She thought he's not wrong that he's afraid. She thought he's wrong about what he's calling it. She put the medal back in the box. Carefully, the way you put something back when you're planning to take it out again soon. Set the box on the nightstand where she could see it. Not in the bag, not hidden. On the table where things lived that were part of her actual life. She went to the kitchen and started on the hand wraps. Her fingers remembered the pattern. Over the thumb, across the back, through the web between fingers, around the knuckles, down to the wrist, with the clarity of something practiced so many thousands of times that it had moved past skill into the category of reflex. The body remembered. That was the whole thing about the body. It waited. It kept what it knew, even through years of not being asked to use it, especially through years of not being asked. She wrapped her hands in the small kitchen, while Portland went about its evening outside the window. She couldn't hear any of it. But the silence tonight held a different quality than it usually did. Not the familiar weight of absence. Something more like the silence before something. The held breath quality of the hour before a competition, before everything you'd prepared for became the actual thing. She'd forgotten she knew that feeling. She was glad to find it was still there. She unwrapped her hands, set the wraps on the nightstand beside the box, fought at the kitchen table, opened the training journal. The early pages were dense, with the decisive detail of someone whose life had been one focused thing for over a decade. Technique breakdowns. Competition analysis written in the systematic shorthand of someone who'd learned to treat opponents like problems to solve. Training schedules that accounted for time the way engineers accounted for load bearing. And then, near the back, a shift. The handwriting changing register. Less structured. More like thinking than recording. She found the entry she'd been looking for. Half a page. Dated 3 weeks before the phone call. Sasha asked me today why I still compete. She asked it like she already knew my first answer wasn't the real one. I said because I'm good at it. She gave me the look. I said because it's what I do. Another look. I said okay because it's when I'm on the mat, nothing else exists. Just this. Just movement and response and the pure, complete problem of the person in front of me. And that's clean. It's the cleanest thing I know how to do, Sasha said. So it's the one place where everything goes quiet. She wasn't talking about sound. She was 17, and she already understood things that take most people a decade of loss to find. I said, yeah, exactly that. She said, okay then, that's a good reason. Nora read the entry once, then closed the journal. She didn't write anything tonight. Tomorrow there would be things to write about. Tonight she just needed to remember that the journal existed. that she'd once been a person who recorded things because they mattered, and she wanted to keep them. She went to bed, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she fell asleep without working for it. Her body, apparently, knew what it was doing tomorrow, and had already started preparing. She let it. Derek didn't sleep. Not really. He did the thing that looks like sleep from this outside. Horizontal, eyes closed. Blanket pulled up to his chest. Alarm set for 6:15. But the horizontal part was the only part working. The eyes closed part was a performance for no audience. And the blanket was just something his hands kept adjusting, because his hands needed something to do, while his brain ran the same loop on repeat. The ceiling of his apartment was not interesting. He'd established this conclusively over the past 2 hours. Water stain in the far left corner, shaped like a boot. He'd noticed it the day he moved in, 3 years ago, and never done anything about it. And tonight it felt like a personal statement he hadn't meant to make. I kept coming back to her hands, the calluses. He'd noticed them during the handshake and filed them into the part of his brain that stored things he didn't want to look at directly, because the calluses on her palms weren't cleaning calluses. He knew what those looked like. He'd hired enough maintenance workers over 9 years to have a clear reference. Cleaning calluses formed at the fingertips, the outer edge of the palm, the base of the thumb where a mop handle sat. These were grip calluses, the specific layered decades built in across the metacarpals. Vent came from grabbing a gi lapel, a competition jacket, a training partner's sleeve, thousands of times, over many years, under conditions that demanded the grip hold even when the rest of the body was exhausted. I'd noticed and he'd filed it and he'd moved on to the next moment, until 2:47 a.m. when there were no more next moments to move on to. I got up, made tea he didn't drink, stood at his kitchen counter in the specific posture of a man stalling against a phone call. Then he made it. 4 rings, which meant Renard was awake. Renard always answered by the second ring if he'd been asleep, the hair-trigger response of someone who'd spent decades on call for athletes in crisis. 4 rings meant sitting up in his Oregon living room, probably with his own tea, probably with a book face down on the armrest. Arek, not a question, not surprised. Did I wake you? No, a pause settled between them, the comfortable kind. The kind that existed between people who'd spent enough time together that silence didn't require management. Do you want to talk? Renard said. Or do you want me to talk? And that specific question was why Derek had called at 2:47 in the morning instead of lying in the dark until dawn. Because Renard understood the difference between those two things, had always understood it, had spent 40 years coaching people, and learned early that the most useful thing could offer someone at the wrong end of the night was the choice. I think I did something wrong, Derek said. Tonight or generally both. I don't know, maybe the same thing. He heard the small ceramic sound of Renard setting a mug down. Tell me, so Derek told him. Not everything. Not the entrance email. Not the number. Not the specific calculation he'd performed with Leo Rivera's enrollment form in front of him. But the rest of it. The boy who learned with his eyes. The mother who'd been so patient and so reasonable, it made the whole conversation worse. The cleaning woman who'd walked out of nowhere and made him feel observed in a way he found completely intolerable. The challenge, the mat, the handshake that left him flexing his fingers. Renard listened without interrupting. When Derek finished, there was a silence long enough to be its own response. You were afraid, Renard said. Not a question, not an accusation, a weather report. I was making a professional judgment about student safety, Derek. A beat. Yeah, Derek said. Of what, specifically? And here it was. The question he'd been circling for 2 years. Since Jason Merritt and the 2 broken ribs. Law school and the look on Gordon Merritt's face in the doorway of that emergency room. Not anger. Gordon Merritt hadn't been angry, which would have been easier. He'd been quiet. He'd looked at Derek with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of something he'd trusted, and he'd said, You didn't see that he was struggling. You only saw what you expected to see. Of not seeing something I should see, Derek said. Of a student getting hurt because I was certain I had everything under control, and I didn't. That's a reasonable fear, Renard said. Yeah, it becomes something else when you use it to make decisions about other people's children without telling them the real reason. The sentence landed the way Renard's sentences always landed, without performance. which somehow made them heavier. Derek stared at the counter, the tea cooling in the mug, the dark window and the street outside doing its quiet middle-of-the-night thing. "There's something else," Renard said. "You haven't told me her name. The cleaning woman? The woman who challenged you. Nora Voss." A pause, longer than the others, different in quality. "Have you looked her up?" "Not yet. Do that before you do anything else tonight." "How do you know?" "Look her up, Derek." And Ren ended the call, not rudely, conclusively, the way a door closes when it's meant to stay that way. Arik stood in his kitchen for 30 seconds, then picked up his phone. The search results loaded in under 2 seconds. First result, image at the top. A woman on a podium. Not a local competition, not a regional event. An international arena, the specific scale and ceremony of a Deaflympics venue, banners in multiple languages. A crowd filling the seats behind the floor. And in the center of the frame, on the top step, a woman with a gold medal around her neck. She looked younger. Not by much, 3-4 years at most. But something in her face that was present in this photograph was not present in the face of the woman who'd stepped onto his mat tonight. Not confidence, exactly. More like the specific expression of someone who has just done the hardest thing they've ever done, and is standing on the other side of it, still breathing. He read, Women's Judo 57 kilogram, Deaflympics 2017, Samsun, Turkey, gold medal. The final. Overtime, sudden death, an uchibimata that the article described as the kind of technique you only attempt when fatigue has burned thought, caution, and all that remains is muscle memory and years of repetition distilled into one moment that is either perfectly executed or a complete disaster. But had been perfectly executed. He scrolled. Competitive record from age 14. Junior national titles. Senior circuit placements building towards something with a clear trajectory of a career going somewhere specific. And then the gap 2017 to the present. Nothing. No competitions, no coaching positions, no clinics, no appearances, no commentary work. A career that had been ascending and then simply stopped. No announcement, no retirement statement, just absence. The way sound stops and leaves only the shape of where it had been. He scrolled further, found a shorter piece. Local paper, smaller publication. The kind of article written by someone who felt obligated to say something without knowing what to say. He read it again, and then he sat down on the kitchen floor. Not collapse, not drama. His legs made a quiet decision, and the floor was available. And he sat with his back against the cabinet and the phone in his hand, and the tea still on the counter above him. The sister. Same year as the gold medal. Weeks after Samsun. A car accident. The sister had been driving, recently licensed, going somewhere, and a driver not paying sufficient attention had made a mistake with consequences that didn't come with a redo. And then Nora. The diagnosis that came after. Sudden sensorineural hearing loss. The residual hearing she'd had. The portion that had survived to that point, gone. The doctors attributed it to acute psychological trauma. The body, having received news, it couldn't sauce through normal channels, shutting down the channel that had delivered the worst information it had ever carried. She'd been 28. He sat on the floor for a while, not doing anything specific, just sitting with the information, which was a different activity than reading it. I thought about the way she'd stepped onto the mat, not performed it, not announced it, just stepped. The way you step onto a surface, returning to something rather than entering it. The self-possession of someone who'd been somewhere before and knew exactly what the ground felt like under their feet. He thought about Leo Rivera at the edge of the mat, watching the adults, trying to determine whether to be afraid. He thought about liability concern, the specific precision of it, how useful, how effective at closing a conversation before it could go somewhere he hadn't prepared for. He thought about Gordon Merritt's face. You only saw what you expected to see. He got up off the floor. He looked at his phone, considered calling Renard back, then didn't, because Renard had given him what he needed, and the next part was his. The coach pointed at the lesson. The learning was always the student's. He did not text Arthur Briggs to cancel. Did not send a message to the group thread saying he'd reconsidered. Did not look for the exit that would let him maintain his position without going through what was coming. Because the exits all required him to be a version of himself he'd spent 2 years constructing out of rules and protocols and the language of professional standards. And sitting on the kitchen floor at 3:14 in the morning, Reading about a woman who'd lost everything in the same month she'd won everything. He wasn't sure. Virgins in and of himself had been solving the problem he'd told himself it was solving. He went back to bed. He still didn't sleep. But the ceiling water stain stopped bothering him, which was something. Small but something. Across the city in the third-floor apartment, Nora was awake too. Not the loop argument kind of awake. Something quieter. Something that felt like a loosening. The way a knot releases when you stop pulling against it, and instead find the end of the rope and work it carefully backward. She sat at the kitchen table with the training journal, Malter, closed in front of her and her phone beside it. Not looking at the phone. Aware of it. She'd been sitting like this for 20 minutes. There was a text thread on her phone. She visited approximately once a month. Not a habit, exactly. A practice. The way some people kept objects from people they'd lost. Not to hold on to them, because you couldn't hold on to them, but to make occasional contact with the evidence that they'd existed. The thread was under Sasha's contact. Still there. The conversation ending mid-exchange and staying ended. The last few messages preserved in the specific amber of a chat thread that would never have a next message added to it. She picked up the phone, opened it, scrolled to the last exchange. She knew it, could have recited it. But she needed the actual words, not her memory of them, because memory got things slightly wrong and the slightly wrong version wasn't what she was looking for. Her own messages in gray, Sasha's in blue. Sasha, you're doing the thing again, Nora.
What thing, Sasha? The I'm fine, Nora, I am fine, Sasha. You've been awake since 4 a.m., Nora. How do you know that's a Sasha? Because you text me at 4 a.m. when you're nervous and pretend it's about something else, Nora. Not nervous, Sasha. Okay, Nora. The timing on the entry footwork isn't landing right, Sasha. See then a gap of several hours.
Competition day. Nora in the arena, phone in her bag. The world narrowing to the specific tunnel of pre-match focus. Then Sasha again, late that night after the final. Sasha, hey, I'm coming to see you soon. Just got my license. I want you to be the first person I drive to visit. Remember to open the door. Nora had seen this message. She'd read it in the first hours after the final. Exhausted and elated in 3 time zones from home. She'd meant to answer it. She'd fallen asleep on the bus back to the athlete's village with the phone in her hand, the reply half composed in her head. She'd never sent it. But below it. And this was the thing she'd found 6 weeks after the accident. The thing she'd read once, and then put the phone in a drawer and not touched for 3 months. Below the message about the license and the visit, sent 11 minutes later, was one more. She hadn't answered the first one, so Sasha had sent another. She read it now. Sasha, I know you probably won't see this till after, but I wanted you to know something. I watched you in the semifinals today. I was supposed to be in class, but I watched it on my phone in the bathroom, with the door locked, which Ms. Patterson definitely noticed, but whatever. You fight like the other person deserves your best. Like whoever's across from you is worth you showing up completely. Most people compete to win. You compete like the other person matters. That's different. I don't know if you know that about yourself. I'm proud of you every single day, but today especially. Now go get the gold. I love you. Nora read it. She'd read it before. She would read it again. But each time something in the angle of it shifted. The way the same light through a window looked different at different hours of the day, illuminating things that were always there but not always visible. You fight like the other person deserves your best. She thought about Derek Holloway, about the specific texture of his fear. Real fear, not performance, the kind that comes from something that happened and left a mark and never quite healed right. About the way he'd gripped her hand too hard, because it was the only kind of force he had available to him in that moment. He deserved her best too, even him, maybe especially him. The people who were easiest to dismiss were almost always the ones for whom being taken seriously mattered most. She put the phone down, looked at the journal, picked up a pen and opened to the first blank page after where the entries ended. She wrote, he called it a liability concern. The actual word under that word is afraid. I know this because I've been doing the same thing for 3 years. Calling it recovery, calling it grief. Both true. Both also cover for the fear underneath, which is this. What if I go back to the mat and it doesn't feel like the thing I love anymore? What if she took that with her? She looked at what she'd written, then wrote, but tonight when I stepped onto that mat, I felt it. Before anything happened, just from standing there. The ground felt like the ground is supposed to feel, so I think the answer is no. I don't think she took it. I think I put it down and couldn't figure out how to pick it back up without admitting I'd put it down. She put the pen down, looked at the ceiling, went to bed, and slept, clean, immediate, the sleep of someone whose body has been waiting for permission. Arthur Briggs received the first call at 8:17 Wednesday morning. He was on his second cup of coffee, standing at his kitchen window looking at the backyard that needed work he kept meaning to get to, when his phone rang. Parent of one of the teenage students. Concerned. Had heard about the situation last night. Wanted to ensure school wasn't going to become the kind of place where things like this happen. He listened completely, didn't interrupt, then said, "I hear you, I'll keep it in mind." Second call at 8:44. Different parent. Similar content, different framing. More worried about Leo Rivera specifically. Was it appropriate to involve a child in this kind of adult conflict? What if it went badly? What was the protocol? He listened, didn't interrupt, then said, "I understand the concern. Thank you for calling." Third call at 9:02. Parent who'd been at Iron Ridge for 4 years, whose son had his blue belt, who considered himself something of a stakeholder. His concern was about Derek's authority and what it meant for the school's culture if an instructor could be public challenged by a member of the support staff. Arthur listened to all of this, then said, "I appreciate you sharing that." Fourth call at 9:23. This one was Carmen Rivera. He listened. And this time, when she finished, he said something different. He said, "I know this is frightening, but I want you to understand something. What happens tonight is not going to go the way Derek thinks it's going to go. And I think after tonight, Leo will have a different experience at this school than he's had so far." Carmen was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you know that?" Arthur looked at his backyard, the overgrown corner by the fence. The garden his wife had kept for 22 years before she stopped being able to. "Because I've known who Nora is since the day she walked in," he said. "And I think tonight she's going to remember it too." After he hung up, he stood at the window for a few minutes longer. He'd hired Nora on a Thursday in October, 8 months ago. She'd come in for the interview in clean work clothes, hands folded on the table, her lip reading precise enough that he'd only needed to repeat himself once when he'd turned away while speaking. Her application had been a single page. Under relevant experience, 3 words: cleaning, listening, waiting. He'd recognized her name immediately. He'd watched Deaflympics coverage 2 summers before that because a former student of his had competed in wrestling. And he'd watched the full broadcast, all 3 days, because he'd had nothing else pressing that week, and competition at that level was always worth watching regardless of the sport. I'd seen the judo final. I'd seen an Uchimata in sudden death overtime from a woman who looked like she had nothing left, and then produced something extraordinary from somewhere inside nothing. I'd looked at the 3 words on her application and hired her on the spot. He hadn't told her he knew. It wasn't information that belonged to him. Her name, her history, her identity, those were hers to carry or set down or reveal on whatever timeline made sense to her. His job was to make sure the door existed. What she did with it was entirely her business. 8 months later, she'd stepped onto the mat. That was her answer. He put on his instructor uniform, drove to the dojo, had things to prepare. By 6:30, Iron Ridge had more people in it than a regular Wednesday class. Parents who normally dropped off and ran errands during the hour had stayed. Students from the afternoon session had found reasons to return. A couple of the senior students who'd graduated out of the evening curriculum had simply shown up, no explanation offered, and nobody asked for one. The folding chairs along the wall were taken. People stood in the spaces between. The room had the quality of a gathering that forms around something unscripted. Not a crowd exactly, more like a community that has sensed something significant approaching and moved toward it without being able to say precisely why. Carmen and Leo arrived at 6:48. Leo was wearing his regular training clothes, the ones with the paint stain on the left knee that was never going to come out. He came through the door and did his usual sweep of the room, building the visual map before committing to a position, and found Nora standing near the back wall, not warming up, just standing, in dark training shorts and a charcoal shirt, feet bare on the mat's edge. Weight distributed the way weight distributes when someone has spent years learning exactly where it should go. Leo made eye contact with her from across the room. She raised one hand, small, just a hand. He raised both of his and signed something quick and certain. She signed back. He grinned, the specific grin of a child who has just been told exactly what they needed to hear, in a language that required no translation for him, and tucked it away like something valuable. He tugged his mother's sleeve and pointed toward the front row. They went to sit down. Carmen glanced back at Nora once. A look that was many things compressed into the space of a second. Gratitude and fear, and something that didn't have a clean name. The specific emotion of a parent who has watched their child be dismissed so many times that someone seeing him clearly feels almost shocking. Nora gave her the smallest nod. Theo Banks came in at 6:51 and took his place against the equipment rack. He put his phone in his pocket and left it there. Derek arrived at 6:55. Through the front door in his gi, black belt tied correctly, which communicated, "Whatever else is happening, I am still the instructor in this room." His warm-up began immediately. Crisp combinations, clean technique, the kind of movement that was genuinely impressive and would have been more impressive if his jaw weren't quite so set, if his eyes weren't maintaining their careful focus on nothing in particular. He was performing readiness. Nora watched him from the back wall and thought, "He knows." She was almost certain. Something in the way he held himself had changed since yesterday. Not the competence. The competence was intact, but underneath it a different quality. The quality of motion that belongs to someone managing new information they hadn't wanted. Good. Better to walk in this clear than comfortable. Arthur called the room to order at exactly 7 o'clock. "Everyone here knows why we're here," he said. "So I'll be brief. What happens in this room tonight stays in this room. That's the agreement everyone accepted by coming. I'll be the referee. Standard modified rules. No strikes to the head, no small joint manipulation, no throws that risk the cervical spine. Match ends with submission, unconsciousness, or my call." He looked at both fighters in turn. Fighters, center. Derek walked to the middle of the mat with his chin level and his shoulders back. The walk of someone who had been the authority in this room for 9 years, and intended that to remain true. He stood in the center and waited. Nora came from the opposite side, and the room he felt it. The change, even focused as he was. The room shifted when she moved. Not gasps, not applause. Just the quality of attention changing, like a camera finding its focus. 8 months of watching her move through this building with the deliberate smallness of someone who'd decided to be easy to overlook, and now that was entirely gone. What was underneath it was something Derek recognized from the competition footage he'd been looking at on his laptop at 3 in the morning. Economy, precision, the specific absence of wasted motion that takes years to build and looks, to the untrained eye, like simplicity. She stopped opposite him, 3 feet of mat between them. They looked at each other, he thought. "I know who you are now." She looked back at him with an expression that said, "I know. And now we find out what you do with that." Arthur said, "Begin." Derek came forward immediately. His best chance was the first 30 seconds. Use his reach, his aggression. Overwhelm her before she found her rhythm. He threw a combination, probing, not committed, testing the edges of her response. She wasn't where he aimed, not retreating, not blocking. Moving laterally, smooth as water, finding the path of least resistance, and his strikes went past her, like she'd been informed of them in advance and simply declined to be there. He tried again, followed with a low kick. She caught his ankle. The room held itself completely still. He was on one foot. Her hands locked around his ankle, with a grip that was controlled, specific. The grip of someone with a clear menu of options, who had chosen none of them yet, and was letting him understand that. She released him. He landed, caught himself, found his footing. "What are you doing?" Low, not for the room. She didn't answer. Both because she hadn't heard him and because the answer was already in her feet. In the repositioning she'd completed while he was still processing the exchange. In the new angle she'd taken that gave her 3 options, and him fewer. She was reading him. That's what all of it was. The catching and releasing, the choosing not to do things she clearly could do. She was building a complete picture, filing his patterns, mapping his tendencies, learning the half-second before he committed to a technique, the specific tell in his shoulders that preceded his strongest attacks. He knew this. He'd done it himself. He understood exactly what he was watching, and understanding it didn't slow her down even slightly. He attacked harder, tried to close distance, get into a clinch, used the weight advantage. His hands reached for her. She flowed around them, not away. Her hands closed on nothing and she was behind him, and she could have. He knew the options, could see them, 3 clean techniques from that position, and she chose none of them. Hust repositioned, waited. 5 minutes in, he was breathing hard. She wasn't. Sweat had darkened his gi along the back. Her shirt was dry. His movements were getting wider, more telegraphed, the inefficiency of fatigue starting to compound. He could hear the room. Not words, just the quality of the silence, how it had shifted from the tense-held breath of the opening to something else. Something that felt like people watching a lesson rather than a fight. Like a question being answered that nobody had known was being asked. He came at her with everything, his biggest attack. Fully committed. The punch that was supposed to end this, all the frustration and the sleepless night and 2 years of Jason Merritt's father's face behind it, converted into forward momentum. She stepped off his line, caught his extended arm, and then Uchimata, clean and fast and exactly as certain as gravity. He was airborne. The mat came up and hit him, and the sound of it was large and final, and the room went into the kind of silence that lives on the other side of something significant. He was on his back. Looking at the ceiling, she was standing, not over him, just standing in the center of the mat where she'd been, as if the throw had cost her nothing, as if she'd simply suggested a direction and the laws of physics had agreed. He heard the room processing murmurs. Somewhere in the front row, a child's sharp intake of breath. He rolled to his side, pushed up. She offered her hand. He looked at it, then at her face, and what he found there was the thing he'd been least prepared for. Not satisfaction. Not vindication, not the expression of someone who'd proven their point. Patience. The specific patience of someone who has decided that the person in front of them is worth waiting for. He slapped her hand away, got up on his own, and kept going. Because he didn't know how to stop. That was the plain truth of it. Stopping, standing in this room as the thing he'd been trying not to be. And he didn't have the equipment for that yet. Not here. Not with 30 people watching. So he kept moving. Kept attacking, each exchange going the same way as the last one. Him spending energy, her spending nothing. The gap between them widening with every passing minute. Fight me, his voice too loud and he knew it. Stop moving away, fight me like you mean it. She looked at him, not cold, not satisfied, just saw him, the way you see someone who is showing you something they hadn't planned to show. She stepped toward him. His fist was already moving, wild. All his frustration and the 3 a.m. floor and 2 years of a mistake he couldn't take back. All of it had converted into this one swing. She stepped inside it. One hand caught his wrist. The other hand came up and rested on his chest, just over his heart. Not restraining, not controlling, just there. Warm through the fabric of his gi present. They stood like that. He looked into her face. She looked back at him with the same expression he'd seen in the photograph from some sun. Not triumph, not even happiness. The expression of someone who has done the hardest thing and is still standing. Who is choosing, actively choosing in this moment, from a position of complete control. Something other than force. She shook her head, slow, clear, no more. Something came apart, not loudly, not dramatically. The way something held together by sustained pressure releases, when the pressure is finally completely gone. His hand went slack in her grip. He stood in the center of the mat with his gi disheveled, and his breathing ragged, and his 9 years of this room around him, and started to cry. Not for the room, not performing it. The kind that happens when you've been running for long enough that you've forgotten what you were running from, and then you stop and the thing is just there, having been there the whole time. Waiting with the patience of something that doesn't need to chase. She didn't move away. She didn't move toward him either. She stayed near enough to be present. Far enough to give him the room he needed. He walked off the mat, sat down on the bench along the far wall. The room held everything it had just witnessed. Carefully. The way you hold something fragile that turned out to be heavier than expected. Leo Rivero sat with both hands still in his lap, watching Derek with the open, uncomplicated seriousness of a child who hasn't yet learned to look away from hard things. Carmen took his hand. He held it and didn't sign anything. Theo Banks stood against the equipment rack with his phone in his pocket and thought, there it is. Arthur Briggs stood at the edge of the mat, looked at Nora. who was standing alone in the center of the training space, and thought about a job application and 3 words and 8 months of waiting for the moment to find itself. It had found itself. And now came the part nobody had planned for, which was always, in Arthur's experience, the most important part. 30 seconds. That's how long the room stayed completely still after Derek sat down on the bench. Not awkward silence. Not the silence of people waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. The silence of a room that has just witnessed something real and is taking a moment to understand what category of real it belongs to. 30 seconds. Then Arthur stepped to the center of the mat. He didn't speak immediately. He stood there for a moment the way he stood in doorways, taking up exactly the right amount of space, no more. His eyes moved around the room once. Students. Carmen with her hand over Leo's, Theo against the wall. Nora still standing where she'd been, feet planted on the mat with the same steadiness she'd carried into the room at 7 o'clock. Then Derek. Derek was sitting on the bench with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly down. His gi was still disheveled. His breathing had slowed but not steadied. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who has just arrived somewhere he'd been avoiding for a long time and is trying to figure out what the address is. Arthur opened his mouth to speak. Derek looked up first. "I need to say something." His voice was quiet, which was unusual. Derek Holloway had spent 9 years in this room, projecting, filling the space with the specific authority of someone who understood that confidence was partly acoustic. Quiet was not his register, it was now. "The insurance company sent me an email yesterday afternoon," he said, before Carmen and Leo came in. "They said that if a student with documented disability status gets injured during training, the policy goes into automatic reassessment. The premium increase they quoted was..." He stopped, found Carmen in the front row, held her gaze. It was significant. "And I looked at Leo's enrollment form, and I made a calculation. And then I went out there and I told you things that were true, but were not the reason. I dressed it up as concern for Leo, for the class, for safety protocols." He looked at his hands. "It was about the number, and about something that happened 2 years ago, that I've been carrying in a way that made me treat your son like a risk instead of a kid who wanted to learn." The room absorbed this, not with gasps, not with murmurs, just absorbed it, the way people absorb true things, slowly, making room. Carmen sat very still. 2 years ago, Derek continued, I had a student, 12 years old. I was certain I knew exactly what he could handle. I pushed past signs I should have caught and he got hurt. Broken ribs, 6 months out. He paused. His father came to see me after. He didn't yell. He just said, "You didn't see that my son was struggling. You only saw what you expected to see." Another pause, longer. "I've been making rules ever since. Lots of rules. And I called them professionalism. And I called them safety standards. And some of them were. But some of them were walls. And last night I used Leo as a reason for the walls, without telling either of you what the walls were actually for." Silence. Then Carmen spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She was a woman who'd spent 10 years navigating systems that required her to be calm in order to be heard, and the habit had become genuine. Not performance, just the economy of someone who knew that volume was rarely the most effective tool. "I know," she said. Derek looked at her. "I knew you were afraid of something you weren't saying. I just didn't know what." A pause. "I've had a lot of conversations like that one, about Leo, in doctors' offices and school meetings and enrollment appointments. People who use the right words to tell me something that has nothing to do with the words." She looked at her son, who was watching her face, reading it. "The words are always about Leo. The actual concern is always about the person saying them." The room heard this. Every person in it heard this. Derek nodded, not quickly, not performing contrition, just received it. Let it land where it was going to land. Then Leo signed something. His hands moved quickly, the small, urgent signing of a child with something specific to say. Carmen read his hands, and her expression shifted. The complex movement of a parent's face when their child says something that is simultaneously heartbreaking and clarifying. She translated. Her voice was steady, just barely. "He says he knew you were scared. He could tell them from how you looked at him. He says he doesn't need you to not be scared. He just needed you to see him instead of the scared part." Eric looked at Leo, 10 years old, paint stain on the left knee, eyes completely steady. "I see you," Derek said. Not theater. Not redemption arc dialogue. Just a fact, stated Steve plainly, by a man who had just spent 20 minutes being shown something he'd been avoiding, and had finally looked at it directly. Leo held his gaze for a moment, then signed again. Carmen translated, and this time there was something in her voice that was trying very hard not to be a laugh. He says, okay. Good. Now when can we train? And the corner of Leo's mouth moved, just slightly. The contained, self-possessed, almost smirk of a child who has been serious for exactly as long as the situation required, and has now decided the situation no longer requires it. Eirik made a sound, not quite a laugh. The thing that lives next to a laugh, the involuntary lightness that arrives when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time. And someone, unexpectedly, helps you set it down. Yeah, he said. Yeah, we can train. The moment Derek's voice found something like steadiness again, Theo Banks moved away from the equipment rack. Not dramatically. He just stepped forward from the wall where he'd been standing, phone in his pocket, arms loose. The posture of someone who'd been waiting for a specific beat in the music before adding his part. There's something else the room should know, he said. Arthur looked at him. Several parents looked at him. Nora looked at him. Theo reached into his pocket, took out his phone, turned it to face the room, screen bright, a Wikipedia page. Photograph. A podium in an international arena, banners behind it, a crowd. A woman standing on the top step with a gold medal and an expression that wasn't triumph so much as the relief of someone who'd done an enormous thing and was still upright. Nora Voss, Theo said. Deaflympics 227 medal. Women's judo 57 kilogram. She won the final with an uchimata in sudden death overtime, which was the throw, the exact technique, the same one she'd used on Derek 17 minutes ago. The room processed this in stages, the way information spreads through a gathering of people who are all paying close attention. First the people close enough to read the screen, then the information moving outward in small waves as people turn to the person next to them, the news arriving differently for each person depending on what it connected to in them. A woman near the back wall said quietly, "She's been cleaning our floors," not accusatory, not embarrassed. Just the fact of it stated plainly, asking to be looked at. 8 months, someone else said. Arthur let the information settle for a moment. Then he looked at Nora, and his expression did something that people in the room recognized as confirmation. The face of a person whose kept secret has just been named by someone else. Theo said, "You knew." Not a challenge, an observation. From the day she applied, Arthur said. The room turned to Nora. She stood in the center of the mat, barefoot, in her training clothes. On rubber she had cleaned 5 days a week for 8 months. And she looked, not exposed, not defensive, not performing ease she didn't feel. Just present, exactly where she was. Which was all she'd ever been in this room. From the first night, she'd let herself the back door. A woman near the middle of the room. Silver hair, Thursday parent. Someone Nora had watched arrive reliably 6 months without ever exchanging more than a nod. Raised her hand slightly. The reflexive gesture of someone in a classroom who has a question they're not sure is appropriate. Then lowered it. Then asked anyway. Why, one word. But everybody understood what it contained. Why the gold medal and the mop? Why the anonymity? Why 8 months of cleaning instead of teaching? Of watching instead of doing? Of choosing visibility when visibility was something she'd already demonstrated she could handle? Honora was quiet for a moment. She gathered the words the way she always gathered them. Carefully. Because words were not her first language, and she wanted the ones she chose to be the right ones. "'Cause I needed to be near the thing I loved," she said, without being the person who had to perform loving it. She paused. "Judo was everything for a long time, and then I lost someone. Not a competition, I lost the person who knew why I did it. The person who understood what the mat meant to me before I could explain it to myself." Another pause. Shorter. "Without her, I couldn't find the way back in. Every time I tried, it hurt in a way I couldn't work through. So I came here, close enough to feel it. Small enough that nobody needed anything from me." She looked at the mat under her feet. That worked for a while. A beat. Until it didn't. The room was quiet with the specific quality of people who are listening with more than their ears. Carmen was crying without hiding it. Not dramatically. Just the quiet tears of someone who has heard something that resonates past the surface into something personal and old. Arthur nodded once, slow, like a decision he'd been waiting 8 months to confirm. Then he said, "Let's talk about what comes next." What followed wasn't a meeting. It was looser than that, warmer. More like a conversation that had been wanting to happen for a long time, and had finally found the conditions. Arthur started it. He'd been thinking about this, he said, for some months. Not planning exactly. He hadn't known what shape it would take or when. But watching Nora work in the building, and watching the gaps in what Iron Ridge offered, and thinking about Leo Rivera and the students like him, who came in and found the door only partially open. There was space, he said, for something different. A program designed from the ground up for students whose learning profile didn't fit the standard instruction model. Not remedial, not lesser. Different in the way a left-handed tool was different from a right-handed one, built for the actual hand holding it. I looked at Nora when he said this. She looked back at him with the careful expression of someone measuring the distance between what they could do and what they were ready for. Those were not always the same distance. I'll think about it, she said. That's enough, Arthur said. It'll be here. Then Derek spoke. He'd been sitting on the bench for most of the conversation. Present? Genuinely present. Not performing presence. Listening to the specific quality of attention that belonged to someone who was learning something rather than managing something. I want to stay, he said. Arthur looked at him. Not as head instructor, not yet. Maybe not for a while. He looked at Nora, directly, without qualification. I'd like to assist with whatever you build, not lead it, assist. Learn how to reach students I don't currently know how to reach. A pause in which he seemed to be checking that the words matched what he actually meant. I've been teaching from a position of certainty for 9 years. I think I need to spend some time in a position of not knowing. See what that teaches me. Nora looked at him. He held the look. Didn't add to it, didn't soften it, didn't hedge it into something smaller and safer. Just held it. She said, you watch first a lot before you do anything. Yeah, he said. That's right. And you tell the truth about what you don't understand. You don't paper over it with protocol. Yeah. Okay, she said. The word simple and final, the way agreements sound when both people actually mean them. Theo Banks raised his hand. The way students raised hands in this room, the old reflex of the training floor. Arthur nodded at him. I've been working on incorporating more visual instruction into my own practice, Theo said. Not as a workaround, just because it makes me a better student. If the new program needs people to cross-train in it, I'd like to be part of that. Arthur looked at him. You'd be giving up evening class slots. I know. Arthur nodded again, the decision visible in his face before he said it. Then the teenage girl, the one with the perfect stance who'd been holding her power back for months, who Nora had watched from the edges of the room and wondered about, stood up from the chairs along the wall. Can I be in the program? She said. I know it's not designed for me. I know I'm not. She stopped. Tried again. I want to learn whatever you're actually teaching. Nora looked at her for a long moment. The girl held the look with the nervous steadiness of someone who has asked for something and is waiting to find out if they made a mistake. Come on Thursdays, Nora said. The girl nodded, like a contract had been signed and witnessed and filed. Then Leo got up from his seat in the front row. He walked onto the mat, deliberately, straight back, chin level, with the dignity of a 10-year-old who has decided that this moment is important and he is going to enter it correctly. He walked to the center of the training space and stood in front of Nora and signed. Carmen translated, her voice finding its steadiness. He wants to know if he can be the first official student of the new program. Nora looked at Leo. Leo looked back at her, waiting, with the enormous patience of a child who had learned early that the things worth having sometimes required waiting for the adult in the room to catch up. You already are, Nora said. Leo considered this for a moment, then signed again. Carmen read his hands. Something shifted in her face, the particular expression of a parent watching their child be precisely themselves. She translated, So, when do we start? Arthur looked at Nora. Thursday, she said. People left gradually. The way gatherings end when nobody quite wants to be the first to go. Conversations forming in small clusters, then breaking apart, then reforming closer to the exit. Parents who'd stayed for the match stopped to say things to Nora on their way out. Not all of them, but enough. The woman with the silver hair held Nora's hand for a moment without saying anything, which was more than most words would have managed. A father who'd been at Iron Ridge for 3 years stopped and said simply, I'm glad you're staying, and moved on before she had to figure out what to say back. Derek left midway through the dispersal. He stopped in front of Nora on his way to the door, and they stood kissing each other for a moment with the specific awkwardness of two people who have just been through something significant together and haven't yet developed the vocabulary for what comes after. Thursday, he said, which meant, I'll be there, I'll watch, I'll start from not knowing. Thursday, she said back, which meant, I heard you. We'll see. He nodded once, picked up his bag, left through the front. Carmen stayed until nearly everyone else had gone. Leo had fallen asleep in a chair along the wall. The deep, immediate sleep of a child whose body has identified that sufficient events have occurred for one Wednesday and has issued a shutdown. And Carmen sat beside him with her hand on his knee. She watched Nora begin the end-of-evening routine. Straightening equipment. Checking the supply closet. You don't have to do that tonight, Carmen said. I know, Nora said, and kept going. Carmen watched her for a moment. She sounds like someone remarkable, she said. Your sister. Nora paused, looked at Carmen, then at the supply closet, then back. How did you, Arthur? Carmen said. He told me a small thing. Not much. Just enough to understand some of what tonight meant. Nora was quiet for a moment. Kind of quiet that was thinking, not withdrawal. She was 17 when she died, she said suddenly. And she already understood things about people that most of us spend our whole lives working toward. She looked at Leo, asleep in the chair. She'd have liked him. The way he just keeps going, with no audience, because the movement is worth continuing. She was like that. Carmen looked at her son. He'd have liked her. They sat with that for a moment. Two women in a room that was almost empty now. The overhead lights doing what overhead lights did after a crowd left, making the space look larger and quieter than it actually was. Then Carmen said, Thank you for stepping out of that supply closet. Nora shook her head slightly, redirecting. He made himself visible a long time before I did anything, she said. He's been doing it his whole life. I just moved out of the way. Carmen nodded, not dismissing this, accepting it alongside the thanks, not instead of it. She gathered Leo gently, the practiced movement of a parent who had carried this particular sleeping child in the car enough times to have developed a technique. Leo stirred, found his feet, leaned against his mother with his eyes still closed. At the door, Carmen turned back once. Thursday, she said. Thursday. Nora said. The door closed. Nora finished straightening the room, turned off the overhead lights in the sequence she'd memorized in her first week, stood for a moment in the dimmer secondary lighting, the room looking the way it looked when it was just a room. Before the students arrived and after they left, the essential space beneath its function, Arthur appeared from his office. He'd been doing end-of-evening paperwork, the administrative residue of running a business. And now he came out with his keys and his jacket and his expression of a man who had planned for many contingencies over the course of his career, but had not specifically planned for this one, and found that was fine. He walked Nora to the back door, the one with the key he'd given her 8 months ago, stopped in the doorway. The key still works, he said. She looked at him. I want to say something, he said, and then I'm going to let it be what it is. He looked at the floor briefly, the way people looked at floors when they were choosing words. I recognized your name the day you applied. I watched the 2017 Olympics broadcast because a former student competed in wrestling. I saw your final. I saw the Uchimata. Paused. I hired you because the application said what it said, and I thought you needed a door. A way to be near this without it, requiring anything from you before you were ready. I should have told you that at the time. Nora looked at him for a moment. Why didn't you? Because it wasn't my information to carry into the conversation. Your identity is yours. I didn't want to make you feel known before you decided whether you wanted to be. She was quiet, processing. I'm telling you now, he said, because you've decided. A pause. Are you all right? He asked. She thought about it. Actually thought, the way people almost never did when asked that question. Gave it the full weight of genuine consideration instead of reflexive reassurance. Not completely, she said. But I'm closer than I was this morning. Arthur nodded. That's enough. For a Wednesday. She went out the back door. The alley behind Iron Ridge smelled of dry cleaning solvent and the Thai restaurant 2 doors down, and the particular damp of Portland at night, the city perpetually 1 hour away from rain. Nora stood in it for a moment, not thinking. or thinking without language, which was different. The processing that happened below words, the body and the mind integrating the events of the last 2 hours into whatever it was they were going to become. And she walked home. The direct route. 20 minutes. She'd taken the long way home past the park many nights over 8 months. The detour with the dogs and the slower rhythm. Tonight she took the straight line, because the straight line was what the evening called for. Her apartment received her the same way it always had, quietly, without demands, except she stood in the doorway to the living room and looked at the wall with its nail holes from the previous tenant. Looked at the picture frames on the shelf, still face down the way she'd placed them 8 months ago, when she moved in. The decision made so early in grief that it had calcified into habit without her noticing. She crossed the room, picked up the first frame, turned it over, a photograph of herself at 24. Outdoors, somewhere in summer, laughing at something just outside the frame. The woman in the photograph didn't know what was coming. Looked out of the photograph with the uncomplicated openness of someone who believed, without having thought about it much, that the future was continuous with the present. Honora looked at her for a moment, then set the frame upright on the shelf. The next one. Another photograph. Her and Sasha both this time. Sasha at maybe 14, at some kind of outdoor event. Both of them mid-movement. One of those photographs that existed because someone had pointed a camera at the right moment, rather than because anyone had posed. She set it beside the first one, the next. A photograph from training camp, years ago. A group of athletes she'd trained alongside. People she'd lost touch with, and not because of the accident. Just because that was what happened with the communities that formed around competition. They were real while they existed, and then the conditions changed and you drifted without meaning to. She kept going. 7 frames total, 6 photographs and 1 drawing. The drawing was Sasha's, made when she was 12, a cartoon version of the two of them in crayon and marker. Looked nothing like either of them, and captured something true anyway. The proportions of their relationship. The older sister slightly taller, the younger sister somehow taking up more space. She found a nail on the wall above the shelf. Previous tenant's nail, there since she moved in. She'd looked at it for 8 months and never put anything on it. She hung the drawing there, stepped back, looked at the wall. The photographs standing upright, the drawing above them. The small wooden box she'd brought out from the gym bag and placed on the shelf's end because it belonged with these, not underneath the bed. Apartment looked different. The same furniture, the same paint, the same light from the same fixtures. But the room had opened somehow, given itself more room to be lived in. She went to the bedroom, changed out of her training clothes, made tea, the kind she would actually drink, not the 2 a.m. kind that went cold on the counter while the mind ran its loops. Sat at the kitchen table, with the tea and the training journal. She opened it to the first blank page after the entries she'd found last night. She'd written 2 lines then. She read them now. He called it a liability concern. The actual word under that word is afraid. I know this because I've been doing the same thing for 3 years. But I went back to the mat tonight, and it felt like the ground is supposed to feel. She picked up the pen. She wrote, Tonight Eric said out loud that he was afraid. In front of 30 people, he said the true thing he'd been covering with the professionally useful thing. And the room didn't collapse. He didn't collapse. He just became someone who told the truth after a long time of not telling it. And that turned out to be survivable. A more than survivable. She paused, drank some tea, looked at the drawing on the wall. I've been afraid for 3 years, and I've had better language for it than he did, which maybe made it easier to maintain. Grief is a word that explains things. Recovery explains things. They were both true. But underneath them, the fear I didn't name was what if I went back to the mat and it didn't feel the same? What if losing her had changed the one thing that was mine before she was gone, and after she was gone, and during everything in between? She stopped, read what she'd written. But I stepped onto that mat tonight and it felt like the ground, like home, like the place where the noise has always gone quiet. She didn't take that. I put it down, and then I was afraid to find out if I'd broken it by putting it down, so I kept not picking it up, and that went on for 3 years. She put the pen down, picked up her tea, looked at the wall again. The photographs, the drawing, the space that had been empty for 8 months and was now something else. She thought about Leo's footwork drill. The one he'd been refining for 3 weeks with no instruction and no feedback, because the movement was worth continuing, regardless of whether anyone was watching. She thought, that's what I've been doing too. In the dark, after hours, in the building where I cleaned the floors. Keeping it going. Not calling it anything. Just keeping the movement alive because the movement was worth continuing. Maybe that's what recovery actually is, she wrote. Not the absence of grief, but the continuation of movement. You keep going in the dark until the conditions change, and the lights come back on and you're still there, still moving, in the place where you always belong. She sat with that for a moment. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote the things she'd been circling. The things she'd been carrying for 3 years alongside everything else. The specific weight that didn't have grief as its name. Because grief was something you were allowed to feel, and this was something else. Something that lived in the register of fault. I should have answered the phone. She wrote it, looked at it. She'd known this for 3 years. The thought was not new, but she'd never written it down, had kept it in the category of things too dangerous to make permanent by giving them language, as if writing them would make them more true than they already were. The truth was, the phone was in her bag. She was warming up for the final. Sasha called. She didn't answer because she was 40 minutes from the most important competition of her life, and she had a protocol for the pre-match hour, and the protocol didn't include phone calls. She was going to call back after. She'd been going to call back after for 3 years. She looked at what she'd written. Then she wrote below it, I can't fix that. There isn't a version of this where that gets fixed. It happened and it is what it is, and I have spent 3 years treating it like a debt I owed and could eventually pay if I was quiet enough, small enough, invisible enough for long enough. But Leo Rivera doesn't stop moving because the environment isn't designed for him. He adapts the environment. He invents the drill. He keeps going. And Sasha would have something to say about the 3 years of hiding, and it would be exactly as accurate as everything else she said. And it would not be kind in the way that comfortable things are kind. And it would be kind in the way that true things are kind, which is the only kind of kindness that actually does anything. She wrote the last thing. Wrote it without stopping to reconsider, without editing, without making it smaller than it was. Sasha, I found your last message 3 years late. I'm sorry it took me that long to look. You said I fight like the other person deserves my best. I forgot that for a while. I forgot to give it to the person who needed it most, which was me. I'm going to try to remember now. I think that's what you were always asking me to do. She put the pen down, closed the journal, sat for a moment at the table with her tea, which had gone from hot to warm, to the temperature that tea reaches when you've been doing something else. Then she got up, went to the shelf, picked up the wooden box, carried it to the bedroom, did not put it back under the bed, set it on the nightstand, opened it, lifted out the metal, carried it back to the living room, stood in front of the shelf with its photographs and Sasha's drawing on the wall above. She looked at the nail above the drawing, already occupied. There was another nail 2 feet to the right. Previous tenant's nail, same vintage, same function. She hung the metal there, stepped back. The ribbon caught the lamplight, winter sky blue, quieter than it had once been, still blue. The gold below it unchanged, the same weight it had always been. The same cost. She stood there long enough to understand that she wasn't putting it up as a monument or a reminder of what she'd been. She was putting it up because it was part of her actual life, and her actual life was allowed to be visible in the place where she lived. That was all. That was enough. She turned off the lamp in the living room, left the one in the bedroom on low, got into bed, lay there in the quiet that was always there, the silence that was hers, that she'd spent 3 years treating as an absence and was slowly learning to understand as a different kind of presence. The world still full of everything it had always been full of, available through the channels that remained. She thought about Thursday. Leo's footwork drill, refined over 3 weeks, waiting for someone to tell him what was already right about it. Derek sitting in the back of the room, watching instead of leading, learning from not knowing. The girl with the perfect stance who'd been holding her power back, who had stood up and asked to learn whatever was actually being taught. The room, after tonight, a different room than it had been before tonight. She thought about Arthur in the doorway of the dojo, saying, I thought you needed a door and understanding that he had simply kept it open and waited, which was its own kind of faith, the quiet kind that didn't announce itself. She thought about Sasha at 17 saying, "You fight like the other person deserves your best." She closed her eyes. Outside, Portland went about its Wednesday night. The buses running their late schedule, the restaurants on Burnside winding down, the particular rhythm of a city that didn't stop so much as shift registers, the daytime version becoming the nighttime version, both versions equally the city, equally real. She couldn't hear any of it, but she was in it, not watching from the outside, not standing at the window looking in. In it, part of it, the city going on around the building where she slept, the building where she would wake up Thursday morning and go to work. Different work than she'd been doing. Work she knew how to do. She fell asleep before she meant to, which meant she wasn't fighting it, which was for a Wednesday, for a beginning, the only ending that the story needed.